It is good to be back for UFC Vegas 84, the first recap of 2024. Obviously, we had the podcast with Sean last week. Check that out if you haven't already. It was a fun one. But 84 events, well, probably a little more than that, honestly, because I don't think they started calling them UFC Vegas until like a little bit into that. But another event at the Apex. I would be so hyped if they did like a UFC Vegas 100, like kind of like the way they're hyping up UFC 300. It'd be funny if like the 100th event at the Apex, if it was like just this big spectacle.
It's been long enough where we have like a few guys that have really have really made like a career for themselves so far, with a majority of their fights in the Apex. You gotta get the Apex legends.
Apex Predators,
all
of it. There's so many different puns you could make with that. It is kind of an amazing
Vegas
name.
100.
Hell yeah, man. But until then, let's talk about UFC Vegas 84 and the main event. Johnny Walker rematched Magomed Ankalaev, and this, like the last one, was in the desert, but this one in Vegas. And Ankalaev, man, he made this one look pretty easy with that like UFC 5 combo that he finished him with that overhand right and the right uppercut up against the cage. That was just some finish for Ankalaev to get, and it was a big win for him. And it puts him right back really into that title picture. But what did you think of this performance from Magomed Ankalaev?
Super encouraging for sure. I think right now, I think it even goes without saying that Ankalaev has kind of been in limbo, especially after how the last fight went, and then obviously having to run it back with Johnny Walker. Like, not ideal, obviously, in a division like light heavyweight that, has so many moving parts to it and whatnot at this time. But he delivered in the way he needed to deliver. I think with Johnny, it's weird because, I think we've really been seeing like the best version of Johnny Walker as of late, and then it's like he really just felt like he ran into a buzzsaw here with Ankalaev. Like, I don't think there was really anything that was gonna stop Ankalaev from getting his hand raised, and in the fashion that he did too. It's like, I don't want to wait around for the title shot no more. Like, I want it as soon as possible. So
in this fight, he really showed why he's one of the best 205ers in the world. I've been on this train that I think he's the toughest fight right now in that division for Pereira, or really for anybody. He's just a fantastic fighter all around. His striking's amazing. He was piecing up Johnny Walker's legs, and Johnny Walker's a long fighter, so it's kind of hard to keep him on the outside. Obviously, he has like an explosive style, Walker, but Ankalaev did a good job at like
explosive. I was saying, I would even say unorthodox too. I thought a lot of the things he was throwing at Ankalaev were just, things you definitely don't typically see. Especially at light heavyweight. But
Johnny Walker's not a typical kind of guy.
He's very much not.
Yeah, but honestly, neither is Ankalaev. Like I said, him piecing up the legs the way he did, his striking is so precise. On the ground, he's amazing. And I think that him saying what he said about, that deal that he wouldn't take Pereira down, I don't know if I really believe that. I honestly don't even like when fighters say that, because, like, while I respect that you want to, like, put on a show for the fans, it's like, this is MMA.
It's a lot easier.
If you could take the guy down, just take him down, But, and I love Pereira, you know what I mean? Like, he's one of the best fighters, honestly, of, like, recent memory in the UFC, one of the biggest stars. And I just think that him versus Ankalaev would be a great fight. But I honestly don't think it's next, just because there's still Jamal Hill, and he's kind of in the same situation that Yuri was in before the Pereira fight, in the sense that, he never lost his title in the octagon. So technically Jamal Hill is a shoo-in for the next title shot, as long as maybe like Israel Adesanya doesn't step in UFC 300 by some like crazy miracle against Pereira. But I don't know. I don't really see that happening. And I still think it's Pereira versus Hill. And then I think Ankalaev could get the winner of that fight. Like, I think he's earned that. But at the same time, knowing how the UFC is, I feel like they're going to try and get one more fight out of him. Especially, too, because you kind of talked about Johnny Walker being at his best, which he obviously is. But I still think to, like, lesser fans, I would say, like people who aren't watching as often, not watching all the Apex cards, they still probably think of Johnny Walker as that guy who's, like, really just like super explosive, but gets beat when it's like a big fight like this. But I honestly don't really think that that was the case. Kind of like you said, I think he just ran into a buzzsaw here with Ankalaev, and I think he deserves credit for this win, is what I'm trying to say. But I don't think he's going to get as much of credit as he deserves, just because of Johnny Walker's resume before this. But that's what makes me think he'll get another fight in between, and I wouldn't mind seeing it be against the winner of Yuri versus Rakic, UFC 300. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it really does just make sense. I mean, you could make an argument that even the winner of Yuri versus Rakic, like they could be the ones getting a title shot right after. But yeah, it is interesting. Obviously, you have Yuri, the former champion, and then Rakic, who's on the rise, just like Ankalaev. So I think either one of those fights is definitely worth putting together and watching. But I guess it's really like you obviously you take the Jamal Hill coming back into play, and it does create a bit of that conversation. But I think for sure on Ankalaev's case, I think it is fair to see another fight from him. You'd definitely be getting that step up, obviously, too, in the competition from Johnny Walker to either one of these guys. So I think that makes sense for sure.
I think it would be fun, and I think it would definitely make a clear contender in a division right now that has like a bunch of contenders. And obviously Hill is the shoe-in for the next title shot, but even if like you didn't think that, you like or you widen your scope a little bit, you have like 4 or 5 guys who are worthy of fighting for the title. And like we've talked about this before, John Jones ruled over that division for so long, and it feels like now with like the constant changing of the guard that we actually have more fun in this division, because there's really 4 or 5 different guys who could be champion on any given night. So I was pretty hyped to see Ankalaev get the win in this one, especially in the spectacular way that he did, because let's be honest, I didn't really see that.
And it's coming. Nice. It's nice not to still have an interim champion as well, and actually, we have an undisputed champ.
But I don't really want to see interim champions at this, especially after this whole Tom Aspinall mess.
But I know, right?
That's a conversation for another day. But let's move on to the co-main event, which is Jim Miller versus Gabriel Benitez. And this was a fight I was super excited for. Anytime I see Jim Miller on a card, my ears perk up. I'm so ready to watch it, and it was amazing that he got to be put in the co-main event, and it shows like how much faith they have in him. 40 years old in one of the toughest divisions in the sport, and he's still mauling guys, man. I mean, this was his he won 5 out of his last 6, and this fight obviously gets the finish over Benitez. I just want to say, like, before I ask you what you thought of this one, I was really impressed in this one by his ground game. Obviously on the feet, he was a step ahead, but it was more of like a scrap when it was on there. But it seemed like when they were on the ground, it just wasn't a contest. Yeah. The way Jim Miller like distributes his weight when he's on top to maintain control, it just looked like he was in another league. And I was just super impressed by it. What did you think, man?
I mean, I thought just coming into this fight, I thought it was definitely an intriguing fight, and intriguing enough to have it as a co-main of this card for sure. And you saw the result. I think on Benitez's end, I think he definitely came in with the right game plan and how he wanted to attack Jim Miller. You got to take it to him early on the feet and whatnot. And I thought, he obviously did a good job of that in the first round, and then in the second round, it seemed like okay, right out the gate, you have to put him away, or before, the longer this fight goes, the more it's obviously going to favor and for Jim Miller, and that's how that played out, obviously going to the ground and whatnot. So you got to give credit where credit's due there, but obviously you got this man Jim Miller. He just continued, he's an absolute just veteran of the game, and it really is crazy to see how a guy like him at his age is still able to move the way he is. At the end of that second round, where I believe it was the body, the triangle he was going for, and he was going he was trying to pin the arm, but it was the end of the round. Like whether it was of that or he just Benitez wasn't gonna let himself get finished like that. But like it was giving me like BJ Penn vibes, and I was like, this is like wild for this guy to still be doing this the way he is at his age. And
by the way, you just mentioned BJ Penn. It's crazy. Jim Miller was already like fighting in the UFC when BJ Penn was last lightweight champion. That's how long Jim Miller has been around. I mean, this was his 43rd UFC fight. Extends his record, 26 wins inside the UFC. And I'm just super impressed by Jim Miller. And honestly, do we even really need to say it? Get him on UFC 300. Yeah. It's right around the corner. He's been talking about it for the past few years. Somehow in this crazy sport, the stars have aligned for Jim Miller to get this fight at UFC 300.
That's pretty wild.
It's time, dude. As Bruce Buffer says, it's time. And honestly, for those who don't know, there's like a reason why Jim Miller wants this fight so bad. One is just an achievement to be in the UFC as long as he has. I think his first fight in the UFC was at UFC 89 in like 2008. So that's just crazy to think about at this point, 16 years ago. But he beat Mac Danzig at UFC 100, submitted Takanori Gomi at UFC 200. It's only right that they put this guy on UFC 300. And like the way that I think about this, like besides, all the things about how Jim Miller wants to be on the card, I also think that he just kind of like represents everything that the UFC is, and in the way that like the UFC and MMA as a whole has evolved so much since Jim Miller has gotten into the sport. And Jim Miller has somehow been one of the few guys, and I know he's never won a title, but one of the few guys who has lasted that whole time and has still been able to beat, your everyday lightweight. And like I said, lightweight is a tough division, man. And the fact that he still is able to evolve his game over time and is still beating guys to this day at 40 is just unreal to me. It really is.
He's a guy that I think propels people in that sense. Like after you fight Jim Miller, like because of everything he's throwing at you in that fight, like you probably that's something that like even if now with Gabe Benitez like going forward, like we could probably see something from him just after this fight, whatever it was that Jim Miller gave to him that he wants to apply going forward. Because, even in this fight, I thought Gabe Benitez, obviously, he put up a good fight, but, Jim Miller is still clearly got it at this point in time, and he's still able to hang.
What's crazy, too, and, like, kind of going back to the fight a little bit before we talk about, like, Jim Miller's possible opponents maybe at UFC 300, but he was more accurate, than Gabriel Benitez in every round of the fight, which I thought was interesting. In round 1, he outlanded him 50% to 41. Round 2 wasn't even close. 73% to 45%. And then round 3 was 52% to 45%. So, like, even on the feet, he was kind of like a step ahead that whole time.
I think Gabe Benitez was definitely trying to set up that, that knockout punch perhaps, and then he couldn't get it in the first round, and then second round was just guns blazing, and then once he, Jim Miller got out of that, it was just all Jim Miller from there. Like, he's gonna hang on the feet, and then if it goes to the ground, then that's how it's gonna end. And there you go. So,
well, let's think about this now. So Gabriel Benitez is a good opponent. He's been in the UFC for a while, and like he always comes to scrap, like I said. So, not an easy win, but not like a crazy win at the same time for Jim Miller. I'd be willing to bet that his UFC 300 fight is going to be a bit stiffer competition, even if it's against another like legend.
Those are some pretty great call-outs, I'd say.
I'd agree. I mean,
the fact that he's even got like Paul Felder on the freaking the presser, like even contemplating, like
don't forget Brock Lesnar.
Yeah,
Hey,
that was the real shot in the dark. It was like, oh man, like this could.
Wait, did you not hear about what Anthony Smith said?
No.
Oh, this wasn't a complete shot in the dark. So I'm so glad that I get to fill you in on this.
Yeah,
this is a bit sidebar, just in case anybody else has never heard this either. But Anthony Smith was on Believe You Me, which is Michael Bisping's podcast, and they were talking about Jim Miller previewing this card, and Anthony Smith dropped one of the greatest things I've ever heard on an MMA show. He says that he thinks that Jim Miller would beat Brock Lesnar in an MMA fight, and Hey man, like it's not honestly like the more I think about it, it's not the craziest thing I've ever heard. But obviously, the MMA world was just going nuts at that whole take to begin with. Because you look at Brock Lesnar,
Yeah.
6'3", 280, and Jim Miller, who's I think probably let me look, he's like 5'8", 5'9", I want to say. I hope I'm not cheating him a couple inches in height, but let's see, I'm on Tapology anyway. 5'8", so. And yeah, he's fighting at 155. It's definitely something to think about. But Jim Miller actually had a cool thing that he said before this fight. He was like, yeah, if we were on the street, I'd have to probably hit him with my van, which I thought was funny. But he was talking about the mentality a little bit of like getting into the cage and how every time he fights, he has to believe that he's the best in the world and he can beat anybody. And it's not like he hasn't rolled and trained with heavyweight fighters in the past and heavyweight grapplers. So like maybe to the person, like to the naked eye, it might seem like Jim Miller has no chance, but when you really think about it, like this dude's been in the UFC for such a long time. He's a high level MMA fighter, high level grappler, and like people want to train with him. So like it'd be naive to think that he's never rolled with somebody who's 200 plus pounds. But obviously Brock Lesnar's a freak of nature, and that's why the call out was absurd in the first place. And I'm so glad that he actually called him out in the cage. But besides Brock, let's talk about the other options. Matt Brown, Paul Felder. I added this in my notes just because I think it was worth saying, but because, you think of UFC 300, a lot of star power. Maybe Tony Ferguson, just because, like, 155, they're not really at similar spots because Jim Miller obviously has won 5 of his last 6, and Tony's lost his last, I think, 7 now. So, different trajectories, which is crazy to think about, but out of the 3, like, who would you want to see him fight the most?
I mean, I think the Matt Brown one probably does make the most sense. Like he's obviously still the only active guy out of the 3, and just
damn poor Tony.
Yeah,
I know what you mean there, but that's funny.
Tony too. The Tony Ferguson one is probably the most interesting in the sense that it has probably the best chance to happen, but it's about it's just I guess it's more about like Tony. It's like it's a fight that should happen if Tony Ferguson's gonna keep it going, but you see with Tony, like I feel like he's gonna keep taking these guys that are still obviously trying to make their names for themselves and put that Tony Ferguson win on their resume. And
it's kind of sad, like how good Tony was, and like I'm thinking to myself that I think Jim would probably beat him currently. I don't know how it would go like when Tony was in his prime.
And then it's like if that happens, and it's like there really just isn't like anywhere for Tony Ferguson to go. I feel like that fight is definitely one he would have to win. For sure.
I mean, all of his fights are must-wins at this point. But to go on the more positive note, we're talking about Matt Brown and Paul Felder. I kind of agree with you that Matt Brown is probably more likely just because he's active. But the Paul Felder fight, I'll admit, that got me thinking when he said it. I wasn't expecting him to call out Paul Felder like that. Kind of would make sense in a way because Paul Felder hasn't fought in such a long time. I mean, think about it. It's been since 2020. Doesn't it? Isn't it crazy? Like when he fought RDA, I think it was... Wasn't it on like a week or days notice or something like that?
Yeah.
So like that felt really recent, but the fact that was almost 4 years ago at this point is kind of crazy. But Paul Felder, if he can get back in the cage, that's a fight that I would like to see because Jim Miller, obviously he's still really good, but at the same time he's on the older side. He's older than Paul Felder by a year, so I think it could make sense. It would be fun, but honestly, I don't see Paul Felder coming back. He seems so content outside of fighting that I feel like Matt Brown is probably the most likely of the 3. But
yeah, I mean, especially for a card like UFC 300 too, like you gotta deliver if you're on that card. So, obviously we just talked about Matt Brown still being active. If it's Tony Ferguson, then I think Tony Ferguson is obviously because it's not like. Obviously it's been unfortunate ways Tony's been losing, but it's not like he's totally embarrassed himself. Like he's putting up a fight. So.
And he's not fighting like bums.
Yeah.
All the guys he's lost to are ranked, or Patty obviously and Nate Diaz aren't, but like their caliber, they're right up there. You know what I mean? And yeah, I just think that Tony, depending on the opponent, maybe it could work. And Jim Miller might be something that could be good for him, but I don't even know at this point. But honestly, I just want to see Jim Miller on the card. They could put him up against me or you. Guys, I'll tank the fight. Honestly. Now I'm not going to get it, so maybe Name Cortez is going to have to step in there. You're going to have to give it your best shot. But either way, I think Jim Miller is for sure going to end up on UFC 300. It's just a matter of when and against who, especially now that he got through Benitez, and that was really the last thing standing in his way. But UFC 300 is honestly kind of shaping up now. We got our first title fight announced on the card, which was Zhang Weili versus Yan Xiaonan. I think I said that right. I'm learning. I'm getting the names down. But that's going to be a fun fight at strawweight. Obviously, the first all-China championship fight. I think that's the main reason why the UFC did it. Obviously, Yan is a deserving contender, but at the same time, that's going to do well in like the Asian markets. And I think it was smart in that sense. But at the same time, I still think they missed a massive opportunity to make Alexa Grasso versus Zhang Weili on a card like UFC 300. I think that could have been one of the biggest women's fights of the year. But, now it's not going to happen, at least not here. And unless it does, I still think Cyborg versus Harrison is the biggest women's fight now that anyone can make in 2024. But either way, I'm excited for the strawweight title fight. Excuse me. Have you heard about the Leon Edwards Khabib rumors at all? This has been an interesting thing to follow these past few days.
Yeah, I've seen it and just never really put that much like thought into it because I just I always like really anything with Khabib at this point I think it's just bait. So
I didn't like this though. Javier Mendez, he was like talking on like a video that he did, I guess, put online. And he was saying how, like, all these rumors aren't true, shutting them down. He was the one who started them. I don't know if, like, how the quote, it could have been taken out of context. But, like, his own quote was that, Habib is training with me and he doesn't train with me unless he has a fight coming up. But I don't know if he does. And then he's like, that's not true. I'm like, you said it. But I don't know, maybe if, like, they're just kind of twisting his words a little bit. So you never know how it is these days in media. But yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think the Khabib stuff is kind of just publicity, but I have to say, if he does come back versus Leon Edwards, that would be such a huge fight. But I still think it's going to be Leon versus Bilal Muhammad.
Yeah, and in the Khabib sense, anyways, like the closest you'll get to that is with Islam Makhachev, anyways. So
yeah, that would be a big fight too, but I don't really see that one coming. Islam has a bunch of contenders at lightweight. I honestly don't like this trend of like guys becoming champions and getting one defense and they're like, I'm gonna move up.
Yeah, I think that's something we need should be said to the fans too. I think a lot of fans just get like hooked up in the sense like, okay, once we've seen the fights from the champion, against the top contenders, obviously we want to see in his division. Once we've seen him beat them, or even like in Islam's case, he goes and beats a freaking Alexander Volkanovski twice. Like, I think people are really like, okay, he could beat anybody.
Well, let's remember too, Volkanovski, he didn't get that shot until he cleared the division.
Exactly.
So
exactly,
it's just...
and that's like the, I guess that's like the thing behind. Even though like a guy is a champion and he's defending his title and whatnot, like people they want to see like that, that. I think it's probably just like the counter effect, obviously the double champ effect and whatnot. Obviously how huge the fight with Nate Diaz was, so people kind of get like hooked up on that and they want something like that again. But
yeah, and Connor's a once in a generation, if not lifetime type person. So it's
at the end of the day, like there are guys in the same division that are waiting for that chance and that opportunity, and then lo and behold, like you'll end up getting one of the best fights you've ever seen. So,
and it builds those double champ fights more when the guys build their resumes. Like if both of these guys, Leon and Islam, if they both get 4 or 5 title defenses, then it's a even crazier fight than it is right
exactly.
now. So like I think
how
I
I
agree
look
with
at
you.
it too.
Yeah, I think the MMA fans have gotten too greedy with the double champ stuff in the past few years, and some of the fighters, honestly, because it seems like that's all they want, and I get it because it's a bigger paycheck maybe, but I don't know. I want to see it off merit, not just because, you know, it's the logical thing to do. But UFC 300 is a few months away. A week away is UFC 297, and that is Sean Strickland versus Dricus du Plessis. The main card's looking pretty fun. Underrated card, honestly. People are sleeping on this. Pennington versus Bueno Silva for the women's 135-pound title. Seems like those are the 2 top contenders, so I'm all here for that. Neil Magny versus Mike Malott, which I think is going to be a good fight. Arnold Allen versus Movsar Evloev. Ooh, woo. And then Charles Jourdain versus Wood. Oh my God, I'm blanking on the name. Woodson. It's on the prelims, but it's like a sleeper, dude. That's why I wanted to bring it up. Now I gotta look it up because it's gonna like piss me off. Oh, how do you? Chris Curtis is on the card too, by the way. Sean Woodson. I don't know.
Yeah, I think people are just taking a look at the main card beyond the main event and just like we're kind of like confused and just like not really all that enthused, I guess, about it. And I think, you know, I was kind of in the dark about like too. I think if I'm not mistaken, like there was a few fights that got taken off this card or whatever, and so it had to be changed.
I don't know about a few, but I know there was some, because I actually got confused in my head when I was writing the outline, and then I was like, wait a minute, this fight got canceled.
Yeah.
It was Jan versus Rakic, and then Jan got hurt.
Okay. Yeah.
So that fight. But besides that, I'm not really sure. I don't think there was another one that was slated for this. But
yeah, I think something like, you know, obviously some of these prelim fights too. I think like definitely worth people's it's worth people's attention. But you know, people really just see the main card and it's like, you know, could do with or without it. But you know, like there's an entire card going on, and so you know,
the first fight of the night, Malcolm Gordon versus Jimmy Flick at flyweight. That's gonna be crazy. Jillian Robertson versus Poliana Viana at strawweight. That's gonna be fun. Like honestly. And there's a lot of Canadians on this card too, so you know, like that crowd is gonna be super loud. I mean, we've seen those Canadian crowds with George St. Pierre, Rory McDonald. They really support their own, and there's going to be a lot of them on the prelims and a few on the main card who are honestly looking really good. So I'm excited for it, but you know, even if the hardcore fans have to build their excitement maybe a little bit through fight week, I still think it's going to be a really fun card, and either way, we're going to be here next week covering it, so see you all then.
Dash up in a foreign car. It's the type of shit that you be doing when you gone.